So a slightly different question, which is just be curious, let's say, as an angel investor, you're primarily looking at people and products early. Larger investor, you're taking in more data and into the calculation. How do you approach studying markets? You wrote a great post a couple years ago about, sort of how important the narrative is when an entrepreneur is trying to partner with an investor. But from a more market-based approach, how have you now sort of thought about that as you look in? I mean, I know you've made interesting investments in and around Bitcoin, around drone, around 3D printing. Obviously, those are all huge markets. Just curious to get your take on how you think about that.
That's a broad question. I mean, there's like a lot of ways you could answer that question. It's a good question.
Any way you like.
So I think that people just vary on how they think about technology in the future, and everyone has their own kind of approach to it. Let's see. I think that,
like, for example, I heard on the radio like a month ago, I just happened to be on a program. This is after you guys made the investment in the drone company.
Yeah.
And the guy was on there saying, yeah, once these things hit commercial, it could be an $80 billion plus market, right? And I just kind of stopped and said, I've never even fathomed that.
Yeah. I think that's a good example. So a lot of these things that we do in this, unlike, let's say, other styles of investing, is we invest in markets that in many cases don't exist yet, right? No one, the people are paying for drones now, but it's basically military, and we're not investing in military drones, right? So we're investing in the commercial drone market, which is mostly non-existent today. And so I think you can't go and sort of look up a McKinsey or Gartner report and they'll make up some number and they'll draw lines, but it's kind of useless. I think what you have to think about is just sort of fundamentally, I think the sort of intersection of two things, which is in some ways just supply and demand, which is the demand being, are there useful things to do with drones as an example, right? And in the case of drones, there are. So for example, there's a whole sort of story about, if you're familiar with precision farming, which is basically that we're sort of running out of land and water and all these other things, and that it turns out if you use your farming resources, water, fertilizer, et cetera, more efficiently, you can get far greater yield out of the farms. And it turns out that aerial imagery is a super valuable part of that, and drones can do that, right? And so that alone, from a demand side, this is all sort of early stage kind of instinct driven, but it seems like a very interesting application, right? And then on the supply side, it's sort of, you ask the question around the technology, is the technology finally here? And so in the case of drones, because you kind of want to hit this, as an investor, you want to hit the kind of intersection of the two. The two things come together. There's demand for these aerial imagery, which is the primary use for commercial drones, and there's supply in the sense of all of the components to make a reasonably priced drone are now here, and they're basically here because of cell phones. Because if you look at a drone, it's a GPS, it's a device. The flight controller, which is kind of the core. I mean, it's got wings and everything in the airframe, but then the flight controller is essentially it's a processor with wireless connectivity, with a GPS, with accelerometers. I mean, it's a lot like a phone. And what's happened because of the cell phone arms race is that these components have decreased in price many orders of magnitude, and the quality has gone way up. And so you kind of have, in the case of the drones, this convergence on the demand and the supply side that make it seem like it's a viable time. Now that's if you sort of categorize venture investments, there's sort of things that are kind of near term and things that are long term. I think our investment in Haywire, the drone company, is what I would put in the long term bucket. Sure. So it's more speculative. I think if you sort of modeled it out on a finance point of view, it has a much higher kind of variance, both on the downside and the upside.
Sure.
But we look at things in terms of a series of investments in a portfolio, and we want to invest in things that are really kind of future looking.
So to kind of sum that up, and when you're thinking about new markets as a VC, you're sort of thinking markets that don't exist could be dynamic. Yeah.
That satisfy a need. You think about if you go back and that great LinkedIn PowerPoint that Reid Hoffman put up the other day, right? It was their Series B pitch deck from, I don't know, when, 2004. I remember I was in tech back then, and I remember Facebook and everything else, and people were like, if you did a standard market size analysis, it's zero. There's no market for social networks. However, there is a big market for finding a job, and there is a big market for, socializing with your friends and things. And so with a lot of these things, you have to sort of think of them by now. The real competitor for Facebook was I don't know, bars and clubs and whatever, socializing, right?
So you're almost taking the narrative approach, in that post
you kind of have to. I don't see how you can do it any other way. You have to kind of just look at it from whether it's narrative or people call it like thematic kind of thinking, or I think there's some lightweight economics in this. When I talk about supply and demand, I'm not saying it's heavy duty economics, but there's sort of some sense of thinking about that and where the world's going, and I think also, like, at least as a firm, we bias towards things that have a heavier technology component, which sort of answers like the why now question. Like, you could say, well, why haven't there been drones for the last 50 years if there's such a demand for them? Well, you couldn't build them cost effectively and sufficient quality and everything else. So.